In our class, we read a chapter of a book called Gulf Women. It emphasized the necessity of producing knowledge in new ways and through locally engaged approaches so that we don't reproduce colonial encounters or we don't reproduce imperial interests that have often really been at the core of knowledge production about this part of the world. I feel like this book echoes a little bit your commitment to new forms of cultural production.
So many cultural practitioners are here, and I very outwardly speak of them as parachuting curators or parachuting researchers who come in and study the UAE like we're a bunch of lab rats. They take the narrative and they claim it, but they miss all of the everything that exists. I think that nobody has the right to the story unless you are participating in the story.
It's my pleasure to welcome today Munira Al Sayegh. Welcome, Munira. She's a friend and an independent curator and an absolute powerhouse. I've known Munira since she first worked at NYU Abu Dhabi, and since then she's curated a number of really fantastic shows at Warehouse 421, Guggenheim Abu Dhabi, and other locations. Munira is committed to developing a grassroots ecosystem for arts in the UAE, and that's why she founded Engage 101 with Gaith Abdallah. And I'm absolutely delighted to have her with us here today so that we can hear some of her stories about what it means for her to do this kind of work that she does in community with others. In our class, we read a chapter of a book called Gulf Women. And in this book, it emphasized the necessity of producing knowledge in new ways and through kind of locally engaged approaches, so that we don't reproduce colonial encounters or we don't reproduce imperial interests that have often really been at the core of knowledge production about this part of the world. I feel like this book echoes a little bit your commitment to new forms of cultural production in this part of the world. And I'd love if you could tell us a little bit about Engage 101, about why, in a way, you are trying to shape a new space for a kind of young generation of cultural producers who are in conversation with one another as they make work. What's different, or what do you hope to get, Yanni, from this kind of thing?
Absolutely, that's a great question, May. I think to kind of start off, I think Engage 101 is something that I co-founded with my partner, Gaith Abdallah. And Gaith and I sit on like the opposite sides of the same coin. We speak about the same things in very different ways. So for me, Engage started about a year ago. It's a COVID baby. And it came out of necessity. There was a conversation. I've known Gaith as my best friend, and I've known him since I was 18 and he was 17. And since we moved back to the UAE, it was a lot of, let's do something. Let's do something. And everything that we wanted to do, and both of us are like deeply intellectual and overthinkers. So nothing came up, everything just kind of, we would stand in our own way, if that makes sense. When COVID came up, he called me out of nowhere. I was sitting on my balcony. He was like, let's consider sales. And I was like, I don't know. I'm a curator. I don't know if this is going to work for me. I had to question a lot of things with regards to, like the ethical framework that exists within the curatorial world also doesn't allow you to be somebody who just sells for the sake of selling. So we had a whole conversation about this, and he was like, Munira, right now the artists are in need. Right now, these artists who don't have gallery representation need a moment to kind of breathe and showcase. Whether we sell or we don't sell, we're doing our part as sort of people who are in the scene, people who are on the ground with the artists, with the creative practitioners. And so with that, I told him, I was like, okay, I'll bite the bait if we can also add a research element to this. So the idea for us was to also make art accessible. And this sort of began to shape how we tackled this this platform, how we wanted to kind of work with it. So for our first sale, I think, which would be a great example, we were able to put together a group of artists who had just graduated from uni, give or take a year or two. And then we were able to find through lines in between these people's work, which is not something that a gallery does. You know, a gallery is looking to sell. With us, a lot of people were like, oh, you guys are here to disrupt the gallery model and the gallery system. And it's not a disruption. I will never talk about my art as about my practice as disruptive. I always consider what I do like a connective activity, something that connects me and sort of my passion with the artist to something else. I come from an art history background, and for me, I was very focused on, in particular, the archaeology of the Gulf, also known as Sahel Oman, pre sort of the modern barriers. And I had that hat on, you know. I was like, this is what art is, and art only has to be old stuff. And then, and what I learned from art history is that a single object can give you everything that you need to know about a particular time. So a single object will tell you about the religion, about the gender politics, about politics in general, about poverty, about wealth. You know, it will give you everything that you need to know via, say, a lantern from the Safavid period, let's say. And so I became very keen and very interested in the idea of stories. How do you preserve these stories? And what ended up happening is, long story short, I got lost in New York one day, and I had just graduated from uni, and I was panicked. Like, it was a mess, and it was nighttime, my phone switched off, I don't know how to use the subway, and I'm just like begging for a cab to appear, like out of nowhere. What ended up happening was I saw a group of creative looking human beings, and I decided I'll walk there and I'll just wait. Maybe somebody will come out of a cab. To my luck, a high school friend that I hadn't seen in maybe 6 or 7 years pops out of nowhere, a Kuwaiti girl, and she looks at me. She's like, Munira. I was like, Lina? She's like, what are you doing here? I was like, I'm waiting on a cab. She said, there's an art exhibition taking place. I'd love to take you in. I was like, okay, you know, I like art. And I walked in, and it was, as you guys might know, of the GCC Collective, which is a group of creatives from the GCC. And they were showing for the first time in their history together, but not as a GCC Collective. And I walked in and I thought, oh my God, what contemporary art can do. And I can be a part of the voice. I can be a part of the narrative. I can shape the narrative. I can say the story. And the story can be mine. I don't have to be reflecting on a time that I don't know anything about. You know, I did not exist in. So this started to kind of become the basis of my my thinking, is that I'm an Emirati woman, and there are a lot of times where people are like, oh, you know, your mother must be half something. I'm like, no, my parents are actually cousins, you know, and like I cannot be more Al Sayegh than I am. And so this really kind of began to aggravate me, especially when I came back to the UAE, that so many cultural practitioners are here, and I very outwardly speak of them as parachuting curators or parachuting researchers who come in and study the UAE like we're a bunch of lab rats, you know, and they decide. And as you were saying, they take the narrative and they claim it, but they miss all of the everything that exists in this community and in this space. And so going back to Sarah Ahmed's, you know, quote, this idea of theory kind of coming from the personal, that becomes extremely essential, because we are at a moment, I'm not going to use the term young country, because the UAE has existed pre the UAE, pre-71, yani the history goes way back. So beginning to understand that history, but also compounding that history with the modern day, I think that nobody has the right to the story unless you are participating in the story. And so, you know, you have a lot of people claiming, you know, your voice and being like, oh, you're not very Emirati, but what's an Emirati to look like? يعني what is an Emirati to think like? But we could be anything, and we could be from anywhere. This kind of created a really interesting sort of, let's say, framework for me to exist in. I started initially working at NYU, and in that experience, I got a lot of this sort of very fragmented understanding. People were telling me what the UAE is, and for me it was like, but wait, like at the time NYU was in Sama Tower and there was a downtown campus, and I was like, you guys are in the heart of it. You're not even segregated from the rest of the world on Saadiyat Island. You are in the heart of Abu Dhabi, and still this is the narrative that you're putting out, the narrative you came with. I have a full team now that works with me, and Emirati citizens are myself and another human being on the team, Hassan Naimi, who also graduated from NYU Abu Dhabi. But then the rest of my team is from everywhere. But I still consider them local. I consider them a part of the vocabulary that is being generated, and they are fresh grads. And for me, that conversation is it's important and it's vital, because to begin to dissect what the UAE is, you need to really be able to hone in various perspectives, A, various voices, B, and then try to find the intersections. Because if things are living in sort of segregation, they could be interesting, yes, but what makes them strong, let's say, is the connection between them. And I've been super lucky to be able to participate in the arts. And we've had so many conversations about this, that there is a breath, there is this sort of inhale and exhale that exists within the arts that allows conversations of politics, of social issues, of religion to take place without it being deemed problematic, because then you can say, oh, no, I didn't say anything, it's just art. So this kind of conversation is what's going to dictate in the future how we are looked at today. After working with NYU, I worked with Art Dubai as an assistant curator, in which I met Mohamed Ahmed Ibrahim, who's a prominent artist from the older generation. And he was doing a residency, and he was still kind of undercover. People didn't know about him much. And for the first time, I learned about my history, my contemporary art history, firsthand from this human being. I also learned about the land that exists in the UAE. I'm a thorough Abu Dhabian. I'm the people of the sea. So I am not the Emirati that will take you to the desert. I will take you to the ocean. And Mohamed Ahmed comes from Khorfakan, and I don't know anything about the north. And the northest I had been at that point was Dubai. And so moving from Dubai, going through Sharjah, going northeast, cutting across to the other side, and seeing mountains that I had never seen in my life, and understanding how that landscape begins to change how you see, how you witness. This idea of a pocket town existing next to such a busy sort of cosmopolitan space like Sharjah, proper Sharjah city center. It felt very locked within each other, but at the same time very separate from each other. And so for me, that encounter kind of propelled me forward. I ended up moving, and that was just like a few months at Art Dubai, and then I started working with the Guggenheim Abu Dhabi, which gladly I can now say they're opening in 3 years, inshallah. And I started working for the institution, and I'm not somebody that can work for an institution because I have my own ideas, because I have my own beliefs, and I have conviction in my own beliefs, and there's no way that anyone's gonna convince me otherwise. If I can be as frank as I can, I think these museums are the Disneylandification of culture. And for me, I couldn't stand by it. I couldn't see the museum buying another artwork and focusing on other artists when I knew 13 floors down on the ground, there was something bubbling and there was something starting. And I will always say, and I'll repeat this, that we are at the brink of a creative movement if the creative movement hasn't already started.
So this is amazing, actually. I just want to pull up two things from what you've said. I think the first thing is, for us, as we sort of embark on this self-tracing assignment, I think we just heard really beautifully a kind of example of a narrative of somebody reflecting back on their life, experiences that they've had, which may seem mundane. This is really the crux of the thing, is how does one tell a story based on lived experience and not simply ideas from elsewhere that either dictate or constrain or shape our abilities to even name our own experiences. Being aware of the fact that lived experience is itself material to then connect with others and theorize up. I think this is, from what I've heard so far, there were like multiple examples of this, which are really beautiful. And I wanted to also just ask you, Munira, maybe to tell us a little bit more about that conversation with Mohamed Ahmed Ibrahim. In a talk that you had given in 2018, you actually sort of almost like laid out this philosophy that you just shared with us now. And you mentioned Mohamed Ahmed Ibrahim as being kind of an inspiration in some ways for really thinking hard about what does it mean to be in community and to form community. And I guess the one thing I want to ask you to maybe share with us is, you had said that you stand against this idea of a hypothetical existence.
I should be careful what I say. I don't know when there's going to be on the other side.
No, it's fine. But my point, and you know, feel free to riff off that. You don't have to like talk about that specifically. But my point is, I guess, is in some ways, you know, I think taking a stance to say that actually not only do I kind of navigate the spaces that I'm in, but I actually shape them myself. This is a whole other kind of dimension. So I was wondering whether you could just tell us a little bit about that, because I think in some ways, many of us who are in institutions, like institutions also do things. They give us resources, they give us opportunities, sometimes they give us a platform. But how does one, in a way, do that without falling prey to being told how to define oneself or how to speak about one's experience?
100%. I think to kind of use that term hypothetical existence, I was just very tired of this idea of, in the future, the UAE is going to be the 2020, you know, like this idea of like the future vision. And that's how I kind of, what I was playing with when I was thinking about this hypothetical existence is that we don't exist in the present, we exist in the future, and the future is hypothetical, but it's forced onto us as fact. And it's forced onto us as something that is not going to change, you know, something that is going to exist exactly as you see it in the posters. I mean, in the renders. I mean, the Louvre was a great example. What I saw in the renders of the Louvre was the building, yes, but also I saw a hypothetical existence of what the Louvre could do. Now, the Louvre exists as its own conundrum, let's say, so for me, it became kind of very clear that the success of these institutions will kind of fall back on the success of what's on the ground. I think this idea of leveling up, but from the ground up as opposed to top down, is extremely important. And it's an important way to live. I think, I can't see the class, but just as the students are, you know, they're there, I think, it's super important that you guys also understand the existence of what breathes outside of campus, because you're not going to be able to take, to give and take with a place that you're not giving and taking with, you know, in its entirety, you know, and that means you have to know where the best falafel is, and you have to know where to get your late night shawarmas. You need to know if you want karak, where to go. Like, just kind of taking from the vocabulary that exists. Now, language is very important. I think learning languages and being a part of a language is extremely important. I tell you guys a personal story about my grandfather, Allah yarhamah. He was sitting down with my cousins, and it was at the cusp when we started speaking in English amongst each other. And it was at night, and he calls me up to his room, and I was like, I'm about to be told off, and I don't know what for. I went into his room, and I was kind of lingering at the door, and he told me to come in. And I came in, and he was just kind of pacing around, very quiet, very pensive. And he turns around and he looks at me and he's like, Munira, and I'll say it in Arabic and I'll translate it. أنت يوم تحلمين في أي لغة؟ Munira, when you dream, what language are you dreaming in? And I was like 17 maybe, and I'm still not that deep of a thinker. And so, you know, I just looked at him and I wanted to answer the question because I had my answer. And he was like, Tasbahin ala khair, good night. Like he didn't want to hear it from me. And this question has become a question that really began to dictate the way I think. Because the moment you start thinking in English is the moment you stop thinking in Arabic. And languages allow you to tap into various places in your mind. And language is very tied to culture. It's very tied to understanding where you're from. I went to the American community school in Abu Dhabi. I was like the only Emirati kid for miles ahead and miles behind. And my English quickly dominated over my Arabic. I went to the UK to study, and then I moved to New York, and then I came back. And eventually I had to do something in Arabic, and I panicked. And I remembered my grandfather's question, and I realized that if you're not dreaming in your mother tongue, then your subconscious mind is not thinking in your mother tongue. It's not existing, it's not breathing, it's not generating in your mother tongue. My whole team is in the next room. I have somebody who speaks fluent Chechnya, Arabic, English, Spanish, Tagalog, French. There's a mix, and that mix is extremely important because the moment you start thinking in these languages is the moment you start painting sort of the true colors of what the UAE is. If you guys begin to see and take notice of the 49th year celebration, there's this idea of the Emirati being anybody who calls the UAE home. And I cannot begin to be more grateful that this narrative is finally surfacing. I think language and those roots are extremely important. I think kind of referring back to that talk, the 2018 talk at Nuqat, I had just come out of DCT and I was full of fire. Like I had plenty ideas, and it's scary for me to see that's 2018, we're at 2021. Everything I said that was necessary to be done, I started doing. And now I am seeing that khalas, that conversation is something I can look back on, be like, we're doing what I said was necessary to do.
That was such a really very interesting reflection on the degree to which things have actually fundamentally in some ways changed, right? Like in the last couple of years, especially with regards to some aspects of the cultural sector. But also this question of this kind of, issue of language, like how is language an infrastructure, not only for the mind, but actually also for the maybe potential for imagination. And I just wanted to share with you in some ways my own, I guess, reaction to what you were saying about language is that I think in many ways, I have my own guilt-ridden things about like, what does it mean that now my comfort zone is probably more in English than in Arabic, right? It's the kind of thing that like the wagging finger of our grandparents or, and more recently, I've also been reconciling myself that it is a generational thing. Like a lot of the people of my generation are kind of in that space or are doing this. How do we also acknowledge the fact that in some ways, it is the language that ends up connecting people? How do you create space for other languages, which by the way, don't even need to be lingual, right? Like other languages, like for example, languages of the body, which I think also generate knowledge, in ways that sometimes are obscured when we're constrained by language in general. And how do we think about language so that it functions in a certain way, not just symbolizes something? So I find that in Arabic, مثلا, recently, I feel a lot of guilt and sometimes shame, because if I don't get it exactly right, even though my entire schooling was in Arabic until I graduated from high school, but recently I've become much more aware of the emotions that are tied to how I am when I speak a language. You know, in what language can I get angry? In what language can I create community? In what language? And so I'm saying this to you because I guess my last prompt before I open it up for questions, from our class is, what is the role of emotion in your work? And the reason I ask you this
Great question.
is it's because it's something that we're trying to experiment with a little bit with this self-tracing assignment. How do you even become aware of how you're feeling about something, especially that in many ways our bodies are disciplined, right? Like in the sense of Foucault, right? Like, I mean, institutions take you and they teach you how to comport yourself. What is too much? What is too little? What are you allowed to feel? What are you not allowed to feel? What is it that you feel that you can't articulate, you know? So after a while, I mean, to kind of undo some of that requires a certain kind of way of being. And so I was wondering if you could share with us your own experience of sort of emotion and what that generates for you in your work.
Absolutely. I think what's very interesting is, not to sidetrack, but yesterday, I'm very close to all of my nieces and my nephews, and I have a niece that very much reminds me of me. And I'm very close to her. Her name is Hassa. And she just had a baby brother. And the world has just gone like upside down in Hassa's land. And she had a tantrum, and I had never seen her throw a tantrum because she's just the perfect human being when I'm around. And, you know, I hear her parents, they're complaining. I'm like, there must be something wrong. And so, funnily enough, she sat down and she started crying. And then I approached her and she was like, go away. And then I just held back my tears because I knew that I couldn't help her at this moment, that she just needed to let it all out. And so I looked at her and I literally was holding back my tears. So I was like, Hassa, I'm going to go to the restroom. And I went to the restroom and I let out my emotions privately. And I came back to her and I was like, are you okay? Can we talk? Do you want to eat? Do you want to play? What do you want to do? And I think it's this idea of knowing what questions to ask. I think emotions as a child or as an adult are very difficult. And we've very much been told you're groomed. There's a grooming to your emotions. There are emotions that are okay to be shared, like happiness, joy, love, you know, the positive emotions. But then the negative emotions, people be like, don't share them, don't explore them. But the reality of the fact is there can't be one without the other. And so for me, it became something that I began to dissect my emotions in. I've kept a journal since I was from grade 2, where I was diagnosed with dyslexia, and it was given to me as an exercise to practice writing. And so I went from talking about this morning, I ate pancakes, to I saw this person and it made me feel this way, and this feeling feels this way. And then from that to kind of understanding the feelings and then abstracting my feelings to a point where I could share my writing as free-form poetry. And people will have no idea what triggered this, but I could be talking about, let's say that one of my kind of personal favorites is I have a thing about like the idea of hierarchies and the idea of permission and what that makes me feel like as an Emirati woman, you know, and as a woman in general, somebody who, I think women are always kind of asked to be a little bit more passive. Not to say I come from a very sort of, my mother's an extreme feminist and she will always stand for women's rights. But with that said, I'll still have to ask her for permission or let her know. And so it's this sort of push and pull that exists that you need to understand. You need to understand trigger points, but in order to understand that, I think you need to understand what questions to ask yourself. As a curator, I need to know what I need to listen. Listening is an extremely important exercise. And if you don't know how to listen, then you won't know how to ask, because it's not the obvious questions that need to be asked. It's what exists in between the lines. It's these individual sort of realities. It's an example of an artist that has become a close friend of mine is Asma Bilhamar. Asma focuses on landscape and megastructures, so the mountains and megastructures. And she's somebody who just keeps unfolding for me, because the more I listen, the more I'm able to ask, the more I'm able to think, the more I'm able to connect my emotions with hers too. So what I do, I think all of the exhibitions that I've put up are a reflection of my existence and my reality. And then I just, I don't borrow stories. I add stories to the story that I know how to tell. And I only know how to tell it because I've been questioning it. In all cultures, people don't want that kid who questions. In all cultures, people are like, ask questions, but don't make them too difficult. Learn how to
ask questions, but don't really ask questions.
Yeah. And خلاص, هدئي شوي, keep calm. But it's important to know also how your tone can affect things. So I've gotten away with plenty, but only because I propose things in a very diplomatic way. And I propose things as questions. I always say I haven't found the answer to any of the questions I've been asking, but I'm still asking. And those questions generate more questions. And my end goal is for there to be sort of a map that's been drawn out from these questions that reflect not only back on me as an individual, but from me as an individual in reflection of my community, who also later then reflect the wider society. I mean, you guys should definitely go check out the show that's up at Warehouse 421 if you haven't yet. As We Gaze Upon Them, curated by Sara Al-Agroubi and Sara Safwan. And it's a lot. They're pushing a lot of boundaries. And Warehouse 421 is a local, it's a space that's grounded. It has its ears close to the pulse. It's listening to us as opposed to listening to the curators in Paris. Sorry, I feel like I'm a little angry about the Louvre, but
no, I actually think it's really Munira, a kind of a really great point to raise about what it means to actually learn and live and grow together, right? Absolutely. Like it's not just about ideas about careers or growth or culture in the abstract. It's also about just actually the physical existence of what does it mean to be sitting in proximity to another person with you in class. Like how do you make community, in ways that are not like flattening or problematic, or in ways that kind of engage the more difficult questions that you're raising. And so I think in some ways, what I'd love to do is maybe that you get to hear directly from some people who would have something to share with you. You might get some difficult questions. I just want to tell you.
I'll be very happy to be on the receiving end. I think language is not just the way, it's not speech, it's behavior. And it's a lot of it is your day-to-day. It's what you eat. It's how you exist alongside others. So as I was saying, I went to the American Community School, and I'm from Abu Dhabi, and I never really considered Abu Dhabi home until I moved back when I was 23, because I felt very outcasted. And I felt in the reality of the frame, I didn't feel at home here. My only other Emirati friends were my cousins. And that reality kind of threw me off completely. And as a family, we kind of exist very differently to the rest of the Emirati families also. So then when I began to realize all of these differences, I just couldn't claim this idea of nationality or this idea of existing here, especially that our accents are different. And, there's a lot that differentiates me from sort of the average or the majority of Emiratis. And so from the sense of the idea to kind of keep it clear, like the idea of sect, the idea of religious sect kind of really influencing your identity and your existence and your breathing. And we are, as a family, people that we're a sea people. We've always been merchants and traders, but we originate from Bahrain. Therefore, for example, the average Emirati says hey as yes, I say e, like my Saudi friend here to the left of me, Miss May. And so and Bahrain also, to understand where Bahrain exists. The idea of Sharqiyya also was considered Bahrain pre the modern, modern boundaries that were set. So this question of claiming, I think, is very difficult, Aya. And the only thing that will help you claim things, going back to what we were saying, is your emotions. يعني للأسف, I would be handing out passports left and right if I could. But the reality of the fact is that this is a nation in its newness. It's just starting to explore this idea of inviting people to exist as nationals, as citizens, let's say. And so I encourage the term local, because the term local allows us to, because anything that's local is local. So going to your local butcher where, the butchers say are Iraqi. It's a very strange example for me to give as a vegetarian. I don't know why that came to my mind, but going there and speaking with the people there, they also have their own stories, and these stories are a big part of who we are. I grew up with two best friends. I didn't have friends until the 3rd grade, and these two girls kind of stuck with me through thick and thin. One girl is Iraqi Palestinian of Canadian nationality. Another girl is American French, and these two girls could not wait to come home after every summer. And I was just like, what home are you guys talking about? So these people who don't have the passport, Mona, for example, the girl who didn't have, who her family left after they graduated, was like, Mooney, I can't believe I'm not going to celebrate Christmas at home. I was like, are you crazy? You're going to have like a white Christmas and, it's going to be snowy and it's going to be like the movies. And, isn't that what Christmas is supposed to look like? She's like, no. In relationship to my identity, no. I want to be able to take a boat out. I want to be able to sit in the sun. I want to see my palm trees. I want to exist and breathe alongside Abu Dhabi. And only when I came back from the States after the UK and New York was I able to really kind of situate where and how I'm going to exist alongside the UAE. And I think that that's sort of the answer that I'll give you. Kind of find your place and find who you are in relationship to it. You had mentioned this idea of existing within lines. Lines are breathing right now. There are no set lines. There's nothing set. Therefore, you can set yourself alongside everything that's happening. So, for example, a great example of an artist that I've seen kind of come to fruition, he's also showing at the Bayn Collective exhibition, is Augustine Paredes. He's a queer photographer who is very open about sort of talking about the queer gaze, and alongside that, talking about how he is a Filipino man who moved to the UAE as of recent and had to deal with this sort of existing via language, also existing as somebody like in the creative scene. Up until Augustine showed up, there wasn't any real representation of Filipino creatives in the scene. Quickly, he started to gain a lot of support from a lot of people. I've been following him from the very get-go, and he started a collective called Satahan & Co. And Satahan & Co. blurs between poetry and art. My first ever exhibition was done in 2017. I wrote an essay, my curatorial essay, and I had no idea what goes into a curatorial essay. And it was received by somebody from sort of the Western canon. And I was told this is not correct, and I was just like, but why? This is how I feel about liminality, and this is how I feel, and this is what I want to talk about. And she continued to insist that, there needs to be structure, there needs to be a particular way of how you voice things. Is it because my voice isn't like American enough, white enough? What is it? You know, are my thoughts not up to par with regards to academia? And why isn't it? Why can't I have that fair claim? And so I think best advice is probably to embrace those differences, to embrace the fact that you don't speak like everyone else. I mean, I very much speak like my own self, and I have like 30 million made up words from the age of 18 up until now, because sometimes I can't find the word that expresses how I feel. And so I'll make up a word and I'll tell them, this is this feeling, you know, like this feels, this is what this means, you know, and my friends will slowly start to pick it up and adopt it in their vocabulary and use it casually. And so when other people are around us, they're like, what are they even speaking? So the idea of language can also be constructed. And so that within itself should be an empowering feeling for you to adopt and take and run with. And these sorts of nuances that differentiate you actually make you more interesting, which is something that most people won't tell you, because when you're different, you prove to become a threat. So, for example, going back to DCT, I tick in a particular way where I can speak to the West, but I also hold my ground with who I am. And so I will not allow anybody to tell me yani, how I'm thinking is incorrect, because a thought is a thought and it's yours and you claim it. And that claim kind of really allows you to shape what it is that you are looking for. I have a great friend of mine, Vilma, who is the director of Sirkal Avenue, which is founded by Abdelmun'im Al-Sirkal. And that tag team is a powerhouse. And what Vilma brings in is very different than what Abdelmun'im brings in. But you can't say that one is more important than the other. It's the tag team that counts. It's the togetherness that counts. It's this kind of back and forth that has made the Sirkal what it is today. I just want you to know that lines aren't set and categories are not set. There's something that constantly changes. This is why you have things like art history, because people can reflect on a time that they also didn't exist in and say, you know, why is this painting not being communicated about in a particular way? You know, today, in the present day, when we can't talk about slavery and what it has done, for example. Why do we still have to romanticize whoever it is that is sitting on the horse and is the king of all kings? Why can't we talk about the backdrop and the importance of what that tells us and be critical about it? So just constantly remind yourself that there isn't anything that's set, A. B, that we are setting new ground as we speak. So you come in with your own ideas and your own thoughts and your own crossovers, and you can add to this formula that's existing. Cultural centers exist to progress the identity, the social identity of the ground it's on. So the moment a cultural center exists, a moment that it exists and isn't being truthful, let's say, is the moment that it dies out, it stops being interesting. I think a big part of me, you know, left that scope and that scene because they were too careful and they were too calculated. Culture is here to progress us as a people. People change, cultures change, things change. And this idea of the male not being able to be attacked, خلاص الوقت وقتك بخلص, you know, يعني this idea that the female cannot begin to suggest what she feels or how she feels about a particular subject is also, you know, is also very kind of outdated. And I think spaces like Munira Al Sayegh is being run now by Fatma Yusuf, who's also a good friend of mine. And she is really trying to kind of bring back things. She's really kind of looking at nostalgia as a basis for people to come back and into the space and sort of add to the space, into the narrative. And I'll give you sort of a real life example to wrap this idea up. But they called me in before the summer for an exhibition opening up, inshallah, in January, called Zaman, which means our time, roughly, my time. And the exhibition is an exhibition looking at the 90s, the UAE in the 90s. The UAE in the 90s is a plethora of things, and there's various catalysts for various things, from architecture to language, to culture, to change, to sort of the pushback from change, to the migration of many into the UAE and into the people that we now, that I consider my family and my siblings and people who are around me and equal participants to this land as I am. They came to me and they were like, we would love for you to curate for us. And I started curate the show for us. And I started laughing. I said, you guys ready to bring me back in? Not as a member from DCT, but as my own self. I was like, because I don't like I don't like the idea of, no, this can't be done. I like the idea of, okay, this is problematic. How can we get this point across without it deeming to be problematic? How do we arrive to a subject about the Gulf War, for example, without talking about the Gulf War? Without it being on the nose. That's what makes an exhibition exciting to begin with, let alone in a place where we're not only, there's no such thing as censorship. I think we self-censor more so than anything else, because we're afraid of the reactions, like the reaction that was had at Semi-Permanent. And I'm expecting there to be a lot of reactions with regards to the exhibition at Warehouse. But Warehouse draws in a different kind of audience who is ready for this. Whereas Munira is looking for comfort, and people just want to come in and take Instagram pictures and leave. And so what I said was, this is going to be a show that's going to be great, because it needs to be something that I'm proud of. I was like, but this list of humans and these artists that you guys are working with, I was like, don't you see that this is fundamentally wrong to have a list of only Emirati citizens talking about the 90s? So the moment that again, Fatma's a friend, so she knew what she was getting herself into. I told her, I was like, I'm very excited to take this on, so long as it can completely be sort of unsandwiched for us to repack the sandwich again. And so I made it very clear and very valid that we need to have artists from various locations, whether they've lived in the 90s or their families have been here in the 90s. And the idea isn't to just reminisce romantically, but to readdress the 90s, to understand where we stand today in regards to looking back, and then what we're bringing from that to the present, and how we are looking at it today with everything that we know today.
Is it an exhibition that's going to happen or no?
Yes, it's opening in January, inshallah. There's going to be a lot of programming around the 90s. There's going to be there's going to be fun parts of the exhibition. There are going to be parts that kind of really take you in and begin to kind of unpack, I guess, archives, personal archives, familial archives. For me, I'm looking at a lot of things right now as from the framework of cartography and the idea of map making. And so to me, it's this sort of regenerated map of the 90s. And so it's very exciting. And there are artists who are going to be showing at Munira Al Sayegh for the first time, and for the first time ever, actually, too, and kind of walking us through the various Emirates from a personal perspective, going back to what we were saying, from personal emotion, from their story, from their being. And I can't say this is right or this is wrong, because if you come at me with your own, all emotions are valid.
When you have a link to kind of the information about where it goes up and whatever, send it to me. I'd love to send it and have people go see it. And then we can be like, You know, we spoke to the curator way before. So anyway, thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
May. Always and anytime. It was a pleasure being here. Thank you for having me.